The blade caught the light just before it fell. You're standing in a crowd pressed tight against stone walls. The air thick with dust and something sharper, the metallic scent that comes before violence. Around you, voices rise and fall like waves. Prayers in languages you half recognize tangled with orders barked in Persian. Then you see them. 300 young women, their hair unbound, walking in a line that seems to stretch forever. Their faces hold something you didn't expect, not terror, but a strange, terrible calm. The guards shove them forward. Someone in the crowd begins to weep. And in that moment, before the first scream tears through the morning air, you understand this isn't an execution. This is an erasure. Before we go further into what happened in those final moments, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It's honestly incredible how a story this dark, from so long ago, still reaches people in every corner of the world today. The year is 344 CE. The place, Ctesiphon. It's the glittering capital of the Sasanian Persian Empire, where the Tigris River curves like a question mark through landscapes of date palms and fired brick. This is an empire at the height of its power, stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of India. Fueled by Silk Road trade and protected by the largest cavalry force the ancient world has ever seen. But empires don't just run on gold and horses, they run on belief. And in the 4th century, belief has become a battlefield. The man who sits on the throne is Shapur II the Great. They'll call him later, though his enemies have other names for him. Born with a crown placed on his mother's belly before he even entered the world, he's ruled for over 3 decades by the time our story begins. He's fortified cities, crushed Arab raiders, pushed back Roman legions, and done something no Persian king before him managed. He's turned religious identity into a weapon of state control, because across his western border, something has changed. Rome, Persia's ancient rival, has embraced Christianity. And now, suddenly, the Christians living inside Persia, peaceful communities who've been here for generations, look like something else entirely. They look like spies. What you're about to hear is difficult. It involves systematic sexual violence used as a tool of terror against women who had taken vows of celibacy. These events are documented in multiple historical sources, but they remain deeply disturbing. If you need to step away, no one will judge you. For those who stay, understand this: we're not here to sensationalize suffering. We're here to examine how power, when fused with paranoia, transforms human beings into symbols and then destroys them. The persecution didn't start with the virgins. It started 5 years earlier, in 339, with taxes. Shapur's wars with Rome were bleeding the treasury dry. Every spring brought new campaigns, new sieges, new shipments of grain and iron that had to be paid for somehow. So the king issued a decree. Christians across the empire would pay double taxes, and their own bishops would be responsible for collecting it. It was brilliant, in a cruel sort of way. Either the church leaders would comply, making them collaborators in their own people's suffering, or they would refuse and become criminals. Simeon bar Sabi, the bishop of Seleucia Ctesiphon, refused. Simeon was in his 50s, a man who'd spent decades moving quietly through the capital's Christian quarter, baptizing children in the Tigris at dawn, sharing meals of flatbread and lentils with families who trusted him. He wasn't a politician, he was a pastor. But when the summons came, when Zoroastrian priests draped in silk robes demanded he hand over gold that his community didn't have, Simeon stood in that marble hall and said no. Not because he wanted to be a martyr, because he believed there were things more valuable than survival. They arrested him on a Friday. On Good Friday, actually Easter week, 344 CE, the timing wasn't accidental. Shapur's advisors understood symbolism. If you're going to break a community, you do it on their holiest day. If you take what they consider sacred and you defile it so thoroughly that the memory alone becomes a wound. Simeon was brought to the execution ground outside the city walls, along with more than 100 clergy priests. Deacons, monks, Ancient chronicles say the crowd that gathered was so large that guards had to be stationed every few feet to keep order. Some came to watch a spectacle. Others came because someone they loved was about to die, and they couldn't bear to let them die alone. The bishop was given one final chance: bow to the sun, honor the sacred fire, acknowledge the empire's gods. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. I worship the Creator, not the creation. They killed him last, making him watch as every man who'd served under him was beheaded one by one. Blood soaked into the ground until the earth couldn't absorb it anymore, pooling in low places, catching the afternoon light. When Simeon's turn finally came, witnesses say he offered a prayer not for himself, but for his executioner. Then the blade fell, and the first great wave of the persecution crested. But here's the thing about terror: it doesn't satisfy itself. It escalates. Over the next months, the killings spread like fever through the empire. In towns along the Euphrates, informants began turning in neighbors. A man who didn't attend fire temple ceremonies. A woman seen making the sign of the cross over bread. Fear became a currency, and betrayal bought safety lighter taxes, seized property. The quiet assurance that your own name wouldn't be added to the lists. Monasteries emptied. Churches were razed. Priests who managed to escape fled east toward the frontier or west into Roman territory, carrying stories that would shape Christian memory for centuries. Ancient sources, Syriac chronicles, Armenian histories, Roman correspondents struggle to calculate the dead. Numbers range from 16,000 to over 100,000. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but the exact figure matters less than the pattern. This was systematic. Methodical. A machine of state violence designed to purge an entire identity from the empire's body. And then, in the winter of 344, Shapur's attention turned to a different kind of target. Her name was Tarbula. She was Simeon's younger sister, somewhere in her 30s, though the sources don't give us an exact age. While her brother had led publicly, Tarbula had worked in the shadows, tending the sick during plague years. Teaching girls to read scripture, hosting quiet gatherings where prayers were whispered and hope was passed from hand to hand like contraband. After Simeon's execution, she became a symbol. The authorities couldn't touch the dead bishop anymore, but they could reach his bloodline. Tarbula lived in a community of consecrated women, what later ages would call nuns, though the formal structures didn't exist yet. These were women who'd taken vows of celibacy and poverty, dedicating their lives entirely to faith and service. In Sasanian society, they occupied a strange, liminal space, respected for their devotion, but also suspect. Women without husbands, without fathers to speak for them, outside the normal structures of control. The accusation came in autumn. The Queen Shapur's wife had fallen ill with a fever. Palace physicians tried everything. Herbs, bloodletting, prayers to Ahura Mazda. Nothing worked. And in courts throughout history, when medicine fails, people look for scapegoats. Zoroastrian priests whispered that Christian sorcery was to blame, that women in Tarbula's community had cursed the royal family, that their prayers were weapons. The logic was absurd, but logic doesn't matter when fear is driving policy. Guards came for them in the night. Tarbula and dozens of other consecrated women's sources say the number reached 300, though some historians think that might be symbolic rather than literal, were dragged from their homes and brought to a palace courtyard where braziers burned and priests in ceremonial robes waited with questions that had only one acceptable answer. Renounce your faith. Worship the sacred fire. Bow to the king's gods. One by one, they refused. What happened next is documented in multiple sources. But the chroniclers of those writing generations later struggle with how to record it. The women were condemned not just to death, but to desecration. Violation was used deliberately, methodically, to destroy what they valued most: their vows of purity, their bodily autonomy, their sense of sacred identity. It was psychological warfare as much as physical violence. The empire wasn't just killing these women. It was trying to erase what they represented, a loyalty that superseded the state. Ancient texts describe the scene in fragments, as if even the writers couldn't bear to look directly at it. Women bound and brutalized in public view. Guards and officials participating in acts calculated to humiliate and break them. The crowd's reaction split between horror and approval, depending on which god you served. Tarbula herself, according to tradition, was singled out. Not just because of who her brother was, but because she refused to scream. Witnesses say she prayed aloud through it all, her voice steady even as her body was destroyed. They killed her by sawing her in Hoffa method, reserved for the worst criminals and traitors, designed to maximize suffering and spectacle. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you defy the throne. This is what happens when you choose a foreign god over your king. But messages don't always land the way their senders intend. News of the massacre spread fast. Roman diplomats along the border recorded it in letters sent back to Constantinople, where it was read as proof of Persian barbarism and used to justify further military action. Inside Persia itself, even some loyal subjects began to question how far the purge would go. Governors in outlying provinces slowed their enforcement, worried about sparking uprisings. The machine Shapur had built didn't stop it would grind on for decades more, but something in the empire fractured that winter. Excess had revealed its own instability. The killings continued on and off for another 35 years. Shapur died in 379, after ruling for 7 decades, probably from illness in his palace. He left behind an empire that was militarily strong but internally scarred. Marked by absences entire, communities wiped out, knowledge lost, trust shattered across generations. And yet, Christianity survived. In hidden rooms and quiet homes, scriptures were copied by candlelight. Children learned prayers in whispers. Survivors carried the names of the dead like seeds, planting them in memory where empires couldn't reach. Within a few generations, Christianity began creeping back into Persian society. Quietly at first, then more openly. Queens converted, nobles followed. The very faith Shapur tried to erase eventually infiltrated the highest levels of the court. History twisted into irony. In the early 5th century, a bishop named Marutha traveled through former Sasanian lands, collecting testimonies from aging survivors. He recorded names, places, methods of execution, preserving what others wanted forgotten. His writings became foundational texts for understanding the scale and intent behind the persecution. Modern archaeology has added its own testimony. Near the ruins of ancient Ctesiphon, excavations uncovered crosses etched into stone, pottery marked with Christian symbols hidden in layers dated to Shapur's reign. In the 20th century, mass graves were found, bones bearing unmistakable signs of trauma. The chronicles weren't legend. They were history. So why does this matter now? Why pull these stories from the dust and force ourselves to look at them? Because the pattern repeats. Label a group as disloyal. Strip them of legal protection. Reward those who betray them. Frame belief as betrayal. Turn neighbors into informants. Make cruelty systematic. The machinery Shapur built in the 4th century has appeared again and again across human history, under different flags, with different symbols, but always running on the same fuel. Fear, married to power. And yet, there's something else here too. Something quieter, but harder to destroy. Resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it survives in the smallest acts: a piece of bread slipped to a prisoner, a body buried with care, a name spoken aloud when silence is safer. The women who walked to their deaths in Ctesiphon weren't trying to topple an empire. They were trying to remain themselves. And because people remembered them, because scribes recorded their names, because stories were passed down even when it was dangerous to tell them, they succeeded. Return once more to that execution ground. The crowd pressed tight, the line of women walking forward, the blade catching light. The empire that ordered their deaths believed it was asserting control. In reality, it was exposing its fear. Shapur's throne turned to dust. His palaces crumbled. His name survives mostly in lists and footnotes. But Tarbula's name is still spoken. Not because she won, 'cause she refused to disappear.